Okay. So will we have some similar colleagues, students coming in, Russ, from our seminar earlier in the year?
Fan Yui from China, who's is
Okay.
I think was probably there, and the other student I don't know at all. Um, but could well be from the name Matilda Martinez. Could be one of our. We have a very large cohort from Brazil and Mexico. So Ufi in Brazil and Unam in Mexico City. So it's possible she's one of that crew.
All right,
I
we're
don't
online and broadcasting, and the time is up, I think, so we can start.
Right. Okay.
A good meeting.
All right. Thank you very much. All right. So, good morning, everyone. Good morning from Germany. Good evening from Australia. And it's impossible for me to see where the other participants may be at the moment, but greetings and whatever time of the day it might be. If there's anyone from Ufi or from Unam, then doubtless you're in a completely different time zone, and but greetings nonetheless from all around the world. So my name is Russ West Pavlov. I'm the person who has the honor to introduce our visiting speaker and to introduce the panel this morning, this evening, um, whatever time of the day it may be for you. So I'll start briefly by explaining that this panel is part of a larger project. So there is an overlap here between the notion of doing futures in precarious times, which structures the entire um, Global South Forum that we hold every year in the European autumn, and another project currently running at the University of Tübingen, which thinks of proximity as a way of understanding and conceptualizing coexistence around the globe. And then one more project running in Australia, funded by the Australian Research Council, and represented here by our colleague from Melbourne, Larissa McLean-Davies, Literary Education Lab, whose icon you can also see on the screen at the moment. And so what you are seeing is a sort of a coalition or a consortium of different projects from around the world, which all have a strong concern with issues of futurity education, and in particular the Global South. So let me introduce our speaker this morning. We had a number of speakers on board, but they've been taken ill, so this is just a single person panel today, but that will give us more time to discuss and more time to reflect. And our speaker is Larissa McLean-Davies, who is part of the leadership of the Melbourne Graduate School of Education. So a graduate school that trains teachers across the whole spectrum of disciplines within the University of Melbourne, trains graduates from other disciplines in education at master's and PhD level. And Larissa is part of the senior management of this institution herself, qualified in English, but responsible for cross-disciplinary programs in teacher education. And she'll be talking to us today about futures, precarities, literary pedagogies, and issues in particular, things that for us are extremely topical at the moment, in particular the role of Indigenous knowledges and the salience and predominance of Australia's Indigenous people, First Nations people, in the emergence of new forms of knowledge and their transmission in pedagogical situations, in particular at high school level. So, Larissa, it's a great pleasure to have you on board today from the other side of the world. across these different time zones. And we're looking forward to hearing you, and we are looking forward to having a lot of time to discuss and debate in the wake of your presentation. Thanks very much. Looking forward to hear you. I hand over to you now.
Thank you very much, Russ. Just checking that I can be heard. That's good. Hopefully that's the case. Hello, colleagues, and it's lovely to be with you. I'm actually coming to you from Singapore. So Australian who's abroad in Singapore at the moment. I've been here at the National Institute of Education as a visiting scholar for the week. So I have been enjoying working and learning with colleagues here. So the presentation, Proximity and Precarity, Literature as Method for New Futures, is a building dialogue that's occurring as part of, as Russ said, between colleagues across literary studies and teacher education and English curriculum, particularly thinking with ideas of proximity in the Global South, as much as we understand Australia to be in the Global South, and there is some debate around that, as you're probably familiar with. You'll see on the screen there, I have my names of several colleagues, or a couple of colleagues. Professor Philip Mead, who's an honorary professor at the University of Western Australia, emeritus professor at the University of Western Australia, and honorary professorial fellow at the University of Melbourne. And Professor Velda Elliott, who's Professor of English and Literature and Education at Oxford University, a university that is definitely not in the Global South, but one with whom we have been thinking through some of these ideas as they relate to the teaching of literature around the world at times when unsettling English and English education is paramount for issues of justice as we look towards addressing the precarity of our futures. What brings us together across institutions, as Russ said, is the Literary Education Lab, an interdisciplinary, multi-institutional conglomeration really of those who are interested in the role of literature in thinking and rethinking issues of education, both the works themselves with particularly Indigenous authors across Turtle Island, Australia and New Zealand, but also thinking particularly with literature as a method for developing new knowledges and understandings. So even though I'm not in Australia, I'm going to begin by acknowledging that the work that we have been undertaking, that I'll be representing here, has in large part been undertaken on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations in Australia, and acknowledge elders past, present, and all Indigenous peoples who are joining us here in this Zoom. This acknowledgement of country is something that has not always been done in Australia, but is something that now is central to all formal occasions and all important occasions when we are presenting and recognising that the land of Australia has not been ceded. And I share with you there a poem that has been, is significant for, oh, sorry, clicked on accidentally, that I give you the opportunity to read, which is going to the notion of land as non-sentient, as significant, as part of the consciousness of the people of Australia, of Indigenous people of Australia. And this will become quite significant when we talk about reading practices for in times of precarity. The notion that there are no trees, rivers, hills, stars that were not someone's kin, someone's family. And if you're interested in looking at that, the book is, the prose poem is from Living on Stolen Land by Ambalun Quamelina, an Indigenous writer. And this book at the University of Melbourne, this collection of prose poems, is one that we ask all pre-service English teachers to read as part of their set reading as they become teachers, not just English teachers, but teachers of any discipline, primary, secondary and early childhood. So in this talk, and Russ, could I just ask you, how long have I got? I know we've had a movable feast with this panel, so just if you wouldn't remind me how long I have.
Altogether, we have 90 minutes.
Great, okay.
Yep.
So we may not, I certainly won't be speaking for 90 minutes, but I'll speak for perhaps about 25 of those, and then we'll see how we go. So first of all, thinking about proximities in context and rereading literature as method, and then giving you some insights from a case study that we are currently undertaking, reading Alexis Wright, Indigenous Australian writer Alexis Wright's monumental work, Praiseworthy, as part of our rethinking how we might teach English in these times. So we're working with, and we take from the work of colleagues at Tübingen, thinking really with this idea of proximities and what this might afford to us when we're considering the work in literary studies, at the intersection of literary studies and literary education. And it's this quote that's been particularly helpful for us in thinking through some of the concerns and ideas that I'll share with you. What is the fabric out of which coexistence is woven if, as Berlant says, we are inescapably in relation with other beings and the world and are continually adjusting to them? Proximity, understood as the closeness of groups, persons, things, or ideas to one another, is integral to all forms of life on Earth, but proximity does not pre-program the nature of coexistence, which can bifurcate towards cooperation or conflict, or a variable, ambiguous, and even fluid, fluctuating mixture of the two. The precise dynamics emerging out of proximity are thus critical for the shape of society. And when we're thinking about the role of English in settler contexts, we're particularly interested in these dynamics emerging out of proximity and what happens when we think particularly with English teaching in a settler society such as Australia, and the ebbs and flows of those dynamics and what that might mean for teachers' knowledge. We're also thinking here, rather than thinking of colony and metropolis as the other, how we might more productively be thought of as each other's context. And we've been asking across both Australia and the other contexts I've mentioned, but also in thinking with the work that's being done by Velda Elliott in decolonising English in England, how these ideas might have resonance. So by way of example, to think about some of these concerns, I bring you into a conversation about this text called We Come With This Place by Dr. Deborah Dank, an esteemed and awarded Indigenous writer. In fact, this text won multiple awards in 2023, including the Australian Literary Studies Gold Medal and many other awards as well. So this comes from Dr. Dank's PhD studies, and it is one of those genre-defying texts, not memoir, not only fiction, not only poetry. But it starts, interestingly, with this prologue of Souls and Stories, and it comes with Dr. Dank sitting in the Bodleian Library. And as Velda Elliott and I were working on this together, we were sitting in her office at Oxford University, thinking about the proximities and differences we had to one another. So you can see there, this is just the opening, and I'll just give you a moment to read this on your own screen. So you'll see there some of the Waka language. The Kunja grew here with Gunja country. So the local country, the knowledge and the knowing of the country of Dr. Dank and her ancestors. So what we hear is, have in this particular text, the proximity of the stories of ancestors that cannot be held, that cannot be contained, that can't be written on pages, being evoked in this space of the Bodleian Library, the space where we have the oldest an old historical text, one that is part of the traditions of Western civilization, thinking in this way. So we see these proximities being brought together, and Velda Elliott and I, Professor Elliott and I, were then struck by the ways in which thinking with proximity was being brought together in this text, and also in our work, where we were trying to uncover what would be teaching a text like Dr. Deborah Dank's We Come With This Place in our contexts in Australia and in England, and what could be uncovered by thinking about that in this way. Part of Dr. Dank's text is very much, it's very conscious of different ways of reading, different possibilities. And the text is set at a time in Australia where white Australians have not been conscious of those stories and have been deaf to, if you like, have not been able to hear the stories that would help them understand issues like climate, like the precarities of future, and have been deeply missed the opportunity to think with the stories of those who own the land, who have been on the land since time immemorial. So this is just a way of thinking with the way in which the literary itself is opening up conversations about proximity for us in ways that were very generative in this initial conversation. And I should also say this is a way of us opening up some of our thinking in this talk that is not yet being finalised. It hasn't been pinned down. The work of the Reading Climate Project is one that is continuing on and has several more years. So a lot of things are happening as we go through. I just wanted to share with you, in thinking about this, and I'm going to be talking a bit more about the ways in which thinking with literature as method in these times requires a different form, or what we are perceiving requires a different form of reading. And I've just taken 2 screenshots of the Dank text here for you. And I don't ask you to read the very close reading there, but I do like you seeing the materiality of the text, even if it is in this kind of form on the screen. One of the second page that you can see there, and you might just be able to discern in the first full paragraph at the top of that second page. Can you see it there? And this is Deborah Dank talking to her husband, Rick. And Rick is a white Australian, comes from a settler Australian background. And they are out looking at hunting wild turkeys on Dank's traditional country. And it becomes clear to Dank that Rick, her husband, is unable to see the wild turkeys in the landscape, even though to her they are absolutely clear. And this becomes then a way of Dank teaching Rick to read the landscape. It becomes clear that Rick, through his way of being taught to read land and place on this level, is unable to see what is there. And so this part of the text works both as a practical lesson for Rick in learning how to read the landscape, so he might be able to capture and take the turkey and hunt the turkey, which is the task that's being undertaken at the moment by the family. But it becomes, of course, metaphoric for us to think about ways of reading and who reads in different ways. And so for the readers of this text, and I think this is another important aspect for us, and here at the National Institute of Education, where I've been teaching students here locally about Indigenous ways of reading, we've been very much thinking about ideas such as Barth's The Death of the Author not being appropriate in this context, because the author is extremely present in this text. And in fact, an act of unsettling literature is to also unsettle those kinds of notions of the death of the author in the ways that they've been animated, particularly in English education. So in this way, we see the unsettling being very much part of reflecting as a reader with the author. What does it mean to read? What does it mean to read closely and at a distance? Because most beautifully in this part of the text, Deborah Dank asks her husband to look differently, to look broadly at the landscape, to see reading not in a deep extractive way, but to see it as a way in which you see the entire landscape in its context. And so this works beautifully metaphorically for us as readers, if we seek to take the invitation to read in this way about our own reading practices in this text. So thinking then with proximities, we're asked to bring ourselves into a different kind of proximity with the text, with the author, and with our reading practices. And so you can then think about Velda Elliott and I, Oxford and Melbourne, thinking about how we are being brought as readers. And I think this is another thing that reading in times of precarity, it is the literary sociability of readers that is extremely important for us to consider as well, and how we bring together reading publics across these questions when we're trying to see what Global South texts are able to offer us to give us new kinds of knowledge and learning. So I want to then move from the example of the literary. We have then been thinking with ideas of school English and proximity. And this just becomes some of our initial thinking. And this is particularly, so if you like, there's a couple of parts to this talk. I need to keep an eye on the time, Professor Westpadler, so I don't just jump out of the time here. But we're really thinking, when you begin to think with proximity and discipline or curriculum, there's many opportunities to think differently and unsettle what we are seeing as the taxonomies of English education. So when Velda and I began thinking then with the text, so we were starting with the text, invited into the text in an Australian British way right there in Oxford, we then began to think of how does this open up and unfold. And we began to think then about an opportunity to think differently with proximities and taxonomies. And here are some of the ways we were thinking. We've been thinking with proximities, and you can see them there on your screen, that when we think with proximities, we can think differently about hegemony in the academy, about time, about intertextuality, a whole range of, if you like, some of the tenets and theoretical grounds of English education, what curriculum looks like, school cultures, all of these aspects of English teaching. We think particularly at the secondary level, but of course in the tertiary level, this is the case as well, how these might open up different ways of us thinking. This becomes, I'll give you then the example, particularly at the secondary level. So the reading, writing and speaking and listening, and these are some of the examples of taxonomies that we so readily see in English education: taxonomies of comprehension, taxonomies of genre, taxonomies of curriculum, of text, with hierarchies being certain kinds of texts such as fiction are more important than other kinds of texts such as memoir and non-fiction. And when we begin to think, well, how does proximities and closeness and distance help us to unsettle what are profound colonial imperial taxonomies of the discipline? And it sounds quite perhaps even obvious when we say these things, but what has happened in English education and literary education in the country that I'm coming from, in Australia, has very much been thinking about Global South concerns, thinking about unsettling English simply by selecting texts by authors such as Indigenous writers. But we see when we begin to think with proximities that there are many aspects of curriculum and discipline and teacher knowledge that then require much closer examination. So in fact, Velda and I have a book proposal in Train around all of these different elements of proximity in thinking with English education. So this is where this work has been headed, and we have a recent article coming out quite soon in English and Education, which is looking at proximity and taking up the idea of genre and fiction and non-fiction around these concerns and working more deeply with the Deborah Dank text that I've been sharing with you in that way. And certainly, Russ, I can send that article through if that'll be interesting to our colleagues here in due course. So that's sort of, if you like, part one, which should all really be almost me over, but part one of this conversation. So I'll just then perhaps move into this second part of the work we're particularly doing in Australia around reading climate. So one of the key things that comes out of that Deborah Dank text and comes out of the work that we've been doing when we're thinking about different forms of reading is what it is to read in line with proximities, but what does it mean to read without this taxonomic kind of extractive structure? And I have here the image for you, a very familiar image in Australia, the image of the mine. So those of you who know very much about Australia will know that it's deep resources, and if you're following the media, there's the Prime Minister of Australia is seeking to broker new partnerships with the US President around particular resources. So this is not an unfamiliar image. You see the image there of the mine. You also see an image there, and it's an image of part of the land where I'm fortunate to do some of my research. It's actually on Boonwurrung country in Victoria, near a place called Phillip Island, where I have some time to do my reading and research. So why I'm showing you this is that so many of our reading practices in English and literary education have been extractive. Following new criticism, they continue to be very deeply extractive, decontextualized, taking extractive and taking meaning out. And it's often in our context, certainly in the context in Britain as well, but it's also the context here where I'm currently sitting in Singapore, in English education, taking out from a new critical approach still these kind of, even when Indigenous texts are being set, or here in this case, Singaporean texts are being set, we still see this approach. So a relational approach, which might think with proximities and relationality at the heart of proximities, is perhaps more a landscape approach. And we see that in the text of Dank. We see that we're not extracting meaning, we are looking at the whole of the landscape in just even that part that I was sharing with you. Now I'll move fairly quickly here, but some of the theory that we've been working with is particularly the work of Koomberri writer and philosopher Dr. Mary Graham. And this philosophical position around Indigenous relationality has particularly been brought to our Reading Climate team by Professor Sandra Phillips, Waka Waka, Goring Goring colleague and academic, also at the University of Melbourne. And you can see there the different ways that Mary Graham is animating this notion of relationality as iterative and generative, reciprocal responsibilities from all parties involved, the opposite, if you like, to an extractive way of thinking and reading and being. I just have a couple more slides around this. So these are some summaries of reading relationally. Not thinking about substitutions, but really thinking of deep ethical and empathetic responsibilities, thinking towards sustainability. So reading relationally rather than reading extractively. And when we think of much of the work that we have taught in English, it's very much about reading extractively. And ultimately, for the purpose of examination, which has its own kind of outcomes. We have then a quote from Sandra herself, which you then have on your screen, and the notion of reading for human and non-human participants and players in the text. So one of the key things we see around this proximity is the proximity of no longer its character and setting, but really seeing landscape, character, ancestor, time is disrupted. All of these things are reading in different ways to the ways that have been read, particularly in English education. Indigenous futurism is another from Carlson and from Dillon, is another frame that we've been using in our work on reading climate, particularly because writers such as Alexis Wright such as Ellen van Neerven and our colleagues from Turtle Island, Professor Sandra Mears-Isaacs, would argue that that all Indigenous fiction is climate fiction, and it is both now and imagining the future if we don't pay attention. Indigenous futurism, and one of the points here on the screen, is also around cosmology. When we read with Indigenous texts, and one of the real challenges is the absence of cosmology that exists in Australian literature. Australian literature without an Indigenous literature starts, 200 and something years ago. So when we think with Indigenous texts, we're really thinking of ancestry and cosmology and spirituality that hasn't existed in the oeuvre of Australian literature as we've understood it. I've got a couple of examples here. I'm going on a little bit too long, but perhaps just to give you another moment of looking a little bit about the Australian landscape. So when we're thinking about relationality and it's deeply seated in the land, I wanted to share these two images with you, both that I had the opportunity to observe from very small plane over northeast Arnhem Land in 2023. And what you see there is a river system in northeast Arnhem Land on the left-hand side of the screen, an incredible natural river system. What you see, and I must say this plane only had 4 seats and one of them was the pilot. So the reason you can take these photos is you're very close to the ground. On the other side, you see what we might see as the Colonial Road. It is cut through the landscape. It is from A to B. And if we think of this as representing different reading practices, reading English in English education in settler contexts, one that is dynamic, one that is relational, one that is connected, and one that is cutting through the landscape, one that is ultimately moving from point A to point B, that is extractive. So the land itself, as we travel over it in Australia, provides us with these reminders of different ways of reading and the ways in which we have read and engaged with the land. I might just stop there because we don't have a lot of time. Perhaps.
Yeah, Larissa, I think actually we're quite honestly, we're fine with time. So I would simply
You show that? Yeah, you're happy for it.
Yeah. Because
Okay.
you as a speaker, so there's plenty of time.
Okay. Oh yes, of course. All right. Well then, what I wanted to, I guess, share with you before I bring you into a little bit more of then the reading climate work is some of the context in Australia where this is taken place. Just before we came on, Russell and I were speaking about the fact that in Victoria, a treaty has been agreed between First Nations people and the government. And, whilst it's not, there's not enough even time, even with our extended time, to give you the history of Australia, it's worth knowing that, as I said at the start, the land has never been ceded. There has been no treaty between Indigenous Australians and government, and which has been a dominantly white government. There was a move in 2023 to try and have a referendum, or to have a referendum which would give Indigenous people 2 things: a place in the Indigenous Constitution and a voice to Parliament, by which was a representative a group, an advisory group that would be able to advise the government on matters that were of significance to Indigenous people. So really, for many people, it was not a particularly demanding request, given the history of Australia, 65,000 years old. The Garma Festival, which takes place in northeast Arnhem Land, which I was fortunate to attend in 2023, this is significant elder Yunupingu from the clan, the clan, one of the many clans there, but an important clan in northeast Arnhem Land, speaking about the importance of this referendum and the Constitution. And why I wanted to show this to you is, I guess, the way in which Indigenous people, Indigenous elders, were reading the land and relationships at this time. It goes for about 3 minutes, Russ. Is that okay?
Sure, no problem.
Okay.
The whole of the continent is linked by the songlines and ancient powers that lie around us and within us. Kuri, Mari, Gabi, Nunga, Palawa, Wemo Anango, Larakia Yolngo. We are all in this together. And all Australians are part of us. Territorians, Victorians, South Australians, New South Welshmen, Queenslanders, Western Australians, Tasmanians, Canberrans. You are all part of our reality. We welcome you here. We listen to you. And we bring you into our ceremony and the life of a people. We don't expect you to know all and every detail. We don't expect you to know even one word from our song cycles, or how to paint the tolang with the designs, or to master a gakal, which is a movement of the ancestors when we dance. We don't expect you to be there every moment during our rituals, or as we care for the country, or use the country. But we include you as fellow Australians. You are in our Constitution already. You are here, and we don't deny the reality of who you are and the life that you have lived in modern Australia. If we denied you, we would be denying the world around us.
Yeah, so thank you for taking the time to watch that. There's a lot that we could unpack there, and what it means for education and what it means for the teaching of English in the nation, for unsettling the ways that education has and is being enacted. I'm sorry to share with you that unfortunately that referendum did not pass through, and so the move to have acknowledgement in Constitution and the advisory group based on Indigenous community all around Australia, the request for that was denied. The Australian people voted up to 70% against that referendum. So there's a lot of work to do. We could talk also about the campaign against that, which was if you don't know, vote no. So those Australians, in a referendum, everyone is obliged to vote. I should have said that. That the voting practices and policies in Australia is that everyone over 18 is obliged to vote in all elections. So this remains a difficult time, and I guess the precarious futures that we're talking about in this seminar, in this 2-day conference event, we see it writ very large, real lives of real people in this way. And when we're thinking about the reading of the literary and the role of the literary in expanding people's understandings and changing knowledges, certainly from my work across literary studies and English education is really paramount. So then thinking with the work we then come to of our Reading Climate project, this begins the context and background. So you can see that I've spoken about the work that we're doing in thinking with curriculum, particularly with VELDA, and thinking with proximities and thinking of unsettlings, and the really expansive work in considering English education that needs to be undertaken, and also undertaken not only in a settler context, but the value in thinking in the global north around what that might look, so that in global English as a globally taught language, the lingua franca for students in secondary schools, that we can think about how the work of the global south, the work of unsettling, might actually move beyond those contexts. So the Reading Climate Project, as was said at the start, has been funded by the Australian Research Council. It has initial startup grant through Melbourne Climate Futures, and it also has a partnership with Stella, which is the prize for women and non-binary writers in Australia. And if you Google Reading Climate, or you search for it on the internet, then you'll find the work of the lab there, and Reading Climate is one of several projects. So we've been very much thinking in Reading Climate in how we then think differently about the building of knowledge of English teachers. And earlier in the year in Tübingen, I shared some of our plans for this project, and so I give you some update on that. The Reading Climate Project had an initial symposium, and I share this with you now because if you follow that QR code and you're interested in this work, you'll see one of our earlier symposia that is still available online through the Literary Education Lab. We were talking particularly about climate and precarity, and it was leading up to our thinking around what we would do with and for teachers, the new learning that we would undertake, which is really what I want to share with you in these last moments. Just to give you a sense of who's on the screen, you're seeing there. So next to me is Associate Professor Sarah Truman, part of the Reading Climate Research Project. Professor Tony Birch, who is both professor and writer, Australian writer. Ellen van Neerven. They are a writer of great acclaim as well, from the place we now call Queensland, writing many texts that are often set for young Australians to study in examination, some beautiful work. Professor Catherine Yusof from Queen Mary, who's Professor of Inhuman Geography, is Professor Sandra Phillips there at the University of Melbourne, and Dr. Claire Archer-Lean from the University of the Sunshine Coast. So in a dialogue about precarity, about reading climate, and around new knowledge. So initial kind of work that has become where we've taken this work in the lab. During that Reading Climate Symposia, this is what Ellen van Neerven said. They said that caring for country is caring as country. You can see that there in the middle of the screen. And reading country is the most important literacy you can have. So you can see how I've been talking about this through the presentation today, both with Deborah Dank's work with the notion of relationality, thinking into the future. And you'll see then, even in Elder Yunupingu's conversation, he said, reading the song lines, reading the stories of the land, it's something that is part of Indigenous reading. So I just wanted to share with you that we then worked with our team to think about reading this significant text, Praiseworthy, by the writer Alexis Wright, which won many awards in 2024, including the Miles Franklin, including the Stella, and various other awards. It's a work of climate fiction. It's over 700 pages long. And I know that there is a colleague at Tübingen who wrote a dissertation, including part of that, and I think is teaching, if not this text, but other Alexis Wright texts as part of the master's program, Russ. So I know that Alexis Wright will be familiar to those studying in Germany. Alexis Wright calls it a work of climate fiction, and we were particularly interested then in testing these ideas of relationality, in thinking of, if we go back to my earlier points around unsettling English and its taxonomies, what would reading this text do? So I just then finish with some of the updates on the way in which we've been working together. So our book groups. As of June this year, we started 9 book groups. In our book groups, we had 95 registrant participants across Australia, and we did initially have some overseas people wanting to join us, but mainly they are from Australia Now. So this to us, for a text that's over 700 pages long, seemed quite an impressive feat. So you see here we have 62 people from the schooling sector, 29 who are identifying as everyday readers, and 4 librarians. We are meeting 6 times to read Alexis Wright's Praiseworthy. And we have some reflections, and Philip Mead and I have been particularly thinking with some of the challenges of reading Praiseworthy for this group. And I share with you that it has been a challenging read, and that we've learnt quite a lot through even the scheduling of this. So book clubs, as you know, mostly are sent to read one text, and they're often considered to be quite middle class, often populated by women, certainly in the country that I come from, and they can tend to enjoy wine and food, and certainly in some book clubs, including the one that my own 80-year-old mother is part of, there's little on the book and much more on the sociability of the occasion. These book clubs are really interesting ways of English teachers coming together, not to be given resources, not to be told how to teach a text, but under the premise that reading the text itself, like Deborah Dank was teaching her husband Rick to read, are a way of being taught. They're didactic in the way that they are teaching us, white Australians, to read differently. That deeply in the text itself is a different way of reading. We have teachers and readers from all around the country, some Indigenous, many non-Indigenous, some migrant readers. It is an enormous alchemy of ages, stages, careers. And so we're really still in the midst of this, where we've through 3 of our 6 groups. And so my sharing with you at this stage is from our initial thinking. The idea of proximity, when we think with what we're seeing, draws attention to the difference that characterises Indigenous writing and therefore challenges non-Indigenous readers. So we've got in one of my most recent book clubs on a Sunday evening, we had some colleagues deeply disturbed of the recursive nature of the text, that they had to read the same information. There's a very difficult part of the text around a suicide that takes place for 35 pages of a young Indigenous character. And the readers in our book clubs were concerned that they were having to read it for so long. Others were saying they thought that was entirely the point. So the fact that the nature of the reading and reading practices is really coming to bear. We've got this sense that we are having access, and Philip was really particularly drawing attention to in this quote, the work of Tracy Moffat in the text called My Horizon, where Alexis Wright talks about the library of the land, that the whole land is in fact a library. And what we see in this is that our teachers are having access in some way through this text to the notion of the landscape as a library in a very different way, but without, as we said earlier, the notion of Australian writing being understood in this way, that there for white settlers is no way of framing up reading practices in the way the text is asking us to read. So we have this, and then again, thinking with proximity about how this is being brought together. So, and I'll finish with this. It seems at the moment to us, it is a sense of knowing when the text and the framing is unknowable. Wright is a deeply relational writer. There are multiple strands of interaction. There are multiple understandings of time that are coming through the text, and the precarity of our future. This is very much a text about the climate crisis. One of the key characters, called Widespread, is attempting to think of a different climate future as well as supporting the sovereignty of his people. But what we're seeing in this is we have to have a different way of reading. There's no way in which the reading practices of our reader teachers are fit for purpose for this kind of text, and this is becoming clear to us. So the challenge for us is in developing new knowledge of reading practices, and this is where we'll finish. And this comes from the conversation I'm having with Philip about this. In times of precarity, there's nothing more precarious than reading practices. So thinking about that and thinking with proximity. So I think I will stop there, and thank you for the additional time. And here we are.
So, Larissa, thank you very much for that. That was fantastic. At times also deeply moving, especially to hear the words of the Indigenous elder. I mean, I have 100 things that I think I would like to talk about, and I'm sure the other online participants have ideas, and Shanti and Fanui and Valeria. I'm sure you'll come up with all sorts of things that issues you want to address. Can I just get the ball rolling by asking something that I'm thinking about in a very different context at the moment, in Eastern African texts, but it's sort of it's sort of something that we always have in the back of our mind as literary scholars, the idea of framing, and the idea that you need a frame to read the text. And I have a framed picture just behind my head. I'm sitting on the sofa here, and so there's this. So it's a sort of a literal idea, but now you've been talking about the way of the fact that it's that we're trying to find ways of working our way towards a very different idea of reading, which is not just a way of approaching the text, but a way of maybe changing the very ways we talk about, or the way we understand our environment and the place we are, especially the ground we stand upon, but also the webs of relationality that make us who we are. And I've been thinking about the idea of the classroom as a sort of a box that we find ourselves in. Often it's a pretty inhospitable sort of place. And there are all different sorts of classrooms, but they tend to be sort of, not particularly comfortable or welcoming in many contexts. How do you and so the literal physical classroom as a sort of a material frame that we find ourselves in as teachers and learners, although your book clubs are perhaps quite different. How do you work with this frame, which is quite dehumanizing and quite separatist and segregating? And how do you, in that box classroom that we tend to find ourselves in, and how do you then think out of the box? How do you get outside the frame? How do you how do you make the idea of proximities a tangible, palpable thing when we're actually, much of our teaching happens inside this sort of box structure, and of course all the other metaphorical boxes that, like examination systems and assessment and curricular constraints. So essentially the question I'm asking is, on the one hand, you've got a very, very, very restrictive environment which teaching often happens, built of all sorts of walls and containers and dividing devices. On the other hand, you've got a notion of Indigenous country which is so expansive and all-encompassing and multi-layered and is all about relationality at every possible level. How do you hold these things together? I don't have a solution to this. It seems to me it's a real dilemma.
Yeah, it is a real dilemma, Russ. And so there's a couple of ways that we're thinking with this. So first thing to say is that, rightly or wrongly, we fantasize that the literary, that engagement with the literary, will have some kind of vicarious, early on in the teaching of English, there was the notion around in the 1970s, around the time of the movement of growth through English and Dixon, of the bystander, the spectator, which has its own kinds of problems, but it was trying to get at the idea that deep engagement with the literary text in a sociable way would enable some kind of experience, the literary experience, which would be able to transcend walls. Now, that is something that increasingly in a high stakes environment and in the research I've done in schools, I remember really in recent times being in a school with the most deeply disturbing literature, in terms of Indigenous crisis being taught in the classroom, and there's sort of no affect in the students because they were being prepared for the exam on this. So, not to say that, but there is a sense that the literary has some role to play there if we animate it in ways pedagogically and for assessment that will enable that work to be done. So that is one way of thinking. But I also do think, and perhaps more significantly, is we need to think differently about space. So we, Arnhem Land, I have a strong memory, 2022, standing in Maningrida on the coast of northeast Arnhem Land with an Indigenous teacher, a very experienced Indigenous teacher from that school, standing in the physical building of the school and being physically turned around by that teacher towards the bush and being told, this is where the school is. The school is not here. You are not standing in the school. You are now looking at the school. So there's an opportunity in context to understand, when we give an acknowledgement of country in Australia or in any kinds of place, to understand that we are actually on the land and what that means, and where the school is actually seated and situated and what it means to be in that space. So there's quite a lot of pedagogical work for students beyond the classroom of recognising their local connections with land and what it is to be on that land. So that's, I guess, the other part of this is it needs to be beyond those four walls of the classroom. So if it's only being discussed in an English classroom or only being limited in this way, rather than being part of a commitment of a school and part of the DNA of the school and connecting with community beyond the school, then the limitations are very clear. So more encompassing, all of these things have their own constraints, but these are some of the ways we've been thinking with these problems around frames. How do you break frames?
Mm-hmm.
The biggest one is assessment.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I'll make space for everyone else, but the sort of things I'm wondering about is as someone speaking from the cold global north at the moment, and you can see them all wrapped up in jumpers and fleeces.
And I'm the opposite here.
And you're sweltering in the tropics.
Yeah.
So in the southwest of Germany, where at least three of us in the group, Shanti and Fan Yui and Valeria, are sitting, although we all have quite different places of origin. We don't have a tradition of country here. We don't have a tradition of being connected to the land via some sort of indigenous cosmology. We have a notion of Heimat, which is maybe perhaps even almost irreparably damaged by the Nazi contamination of that notion. So I'm wondering how do we frame these things in different contexts, and how do you? I think what you're doing is incredibly challenging and exciting and deframing. How do you take it outside of a particular national frame and transport it to another place? I've had an online conversation at times with Kim Scott about this. Can country be everywhere? Can
Mm.
country be in Europe, for instance? It's quite interesting to.
Mm.
So the an issue, sort of a question about the transportability of your project into a
Mm.
into a global context where of course climate change is impacting everywhere. Can you translate this notion of reading for country or reading as caring as country into other?
Reading as country.
Yeah.
Well, part of it is, you know, I can never read as an Indigenous person. You know, it's not something I can do as a settler Australian. And so, but what I hope that we can learn to do is to read, you know, it would, and I would be interested in hearing what Kim Scott has said about that. But all land is has been someone's land, and it is land, and it is connection, and relationality is as a framework and as a practice, I would argue is absolutely necessary. We know this in the climate crisis, that the relationships between humans and the land and caring as country is a kind of fundamental paradigm for the survival of the world. So we know this, but what Indigenous thinking gives us is ways of operationalizing that in our context. I mean, we're quite comfortable, aren't we, in transporting post-structuralist theories to the global south. So we don't think for a moment, for instance, that we couldn't do that and it wouldn't have resonance and it couldn't actually impact ontologically on citizens in another place. You know, I think about feminism for me initially, you know, the impacts of that started not as a movement in the place. So I think we need to understand what we are learning from Indigenous cultures, which are, you know, Turtle Island in the north. You know, there's a whole range of places we can learn about these things. In African continents, you know, there's places we learn from this, but then we need to think of what does stewardship look like, perhaps, in relationality in all of those contexts. And stewardship is another concept I think that some of us might be able to consider alongside relationality and country, recognizing that it's the framing. And in fact, I had a similar question here this week in Singapore, Russ, because this notion that, well, you know, we don't have the same kind of Indigenous contexts, but the concept of this place and stewardship and responsibility for it, and what we might learn from the people who have the deep relationships with it, and that we also have our own relationships. I don't think we can not take the opportunity to do that because it looks different in different places. So I just, you know, I think of the white movement of the empire and the ways in which we can learn from that. But I do think it requires those of us in a position to think in these ways, to make a commitment to doing that.
There's a question from the public. Do you want to take it?
Yes, please. I can't see it, but I'm happy to take it. Oh, hello, Valeria.
Valeria, hi.
Hello, Valeria. Would you like to give your question?
Valeria, your mic is muted.
Now it's working?
Now it's
working. Perfect.
Okay. Thank you very much for your presentation and also for being here. I think that we met in the spring school, and yeah, I just want to ask you a little bit more about these reading spaces, because you show us during the presentation this mosaic of the readings, and you were using Zoom. And I want to ask you just two questions, and it's did you ever perceive, or when you were there was like moments of healing, or like healing understanding the sense of connection between people who have gone through loss or trauma? And that's like my first question. And the second one is if maybe you can explain, I don't know if it's just like one case, but in the case that it was, there was a change in the rhythm or in the cadence of reading together and how it changed the emotional states, or yeah, there was a collective resonance and proximity, and also if there was not physically but online, like a little bit like now.
Yeah. So I think the question, thank you for those questions, Valeria. I think the question of healing is healing for who? You know, are you healing for who in that spot? So I think there is the notion, certainly from Indigenous colleagues I am privileged to be working with in this project, that there is a sense that, and for Indigenous students and teachers who I've been working with, that it is necessary for stories to be read, for different ways of reading to be part of the conversation. The Reading Climate team, before we embarked on this endeavour, created our own book group. So we read it, but we also read and discussed. And I don't know if it was moments of healing, but it was certainly moments of, when reading with my Indigenous colleagues, and the privilege it was to do that, moments of a much deeper recognition of pain and trauma that was simply not, even as one who would say, I have been very aware of this. And I think that having the shared story to read and discuss for our team was a significant moment of community, whether or not that was healing, that sense of a community, a shared reading, a shared enterprise. When in the book group, I mentioned a very difficult scene, suicide. In one of the book groups, it was a makeup book group. One of the interesting things about the book groups is, even though my colleague Claire Archeline at the University of the Sunshine Coast, very, very rigorous, excellent literary scholar, we mapped out our book groups. We were all to read certain amounts of pages at certain amounts of time. And then, of course, this book doesn't allow you to read in the way you want to read. You go back, you go forward. We've been having book groups. I've been running additional book groups when people want to come and talk more about something or go back to something. And in one of my additional catch-up book groups, if you like, I had an Indigenous scholar, reader, an English teacher, various other, basically the mix of the people you saw on the screen. And I was very aware of the potential of this text actually for not healing, for Indigenous people reading with others in this space, of in fact potentially re-traumatizing when reading with white settlers who have not got necessarily the deep historical understanding. So I share that, this kind of early findings, but share that with you, that this is very complex work. It's really complex work. And it's not, so not so straightforward on that front. To your other point about people and their shared changed reading, as I said, we're still working through the transcripts and data, and perhaps at another time when we are all together, I'll look forward to sharing the real, the deep analysis of the transcripts, the hours and hours of these book groups which we have. But about a month ago, I ran a book group on a Sunday night and had perhaps what I felt was the most extraordinary experience between English teachers. This is a group entirely of English teachers right around the country. And there was one moment where one of the teachers was very frustrated with the text. He was extremely frustrated with the recursive nature, with the long sentences, with the lack of dialogue, with a whole range of things. And he really wanted it to be a Thomas Pynchon novel. He really wanted that. around this group, other readers, other teacher readers were expressing the fact that they had faced similar frustrations, but in fact were now beginning to feel that this was the point of the reading, that they were being invited into different reading practices, ones that they weren't comfortable with, but ones that they felt were necessary. So in that book group, we had very different views. So the answer to that, Valeria, would be it appears that some are reading differently and some are yet to read differently and maybe won't read differently. And that itself will be interesting for us to share.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Do we have other questions from the group? Shanti Fanui?
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Hello,
Yeah.
Shanti.
Hello, good morning from
Yay, Shanti.
Thanks a lot for your talk. I have a comment or a thought that emerged because I had to think about Russell's work on classrooms as a fourth wall, and where there is a connection to the fourth wall in Brecht's traditional drama. And Brecht says you have to break it. And then I made the connection to the book clubs, where it's a space that somehow holds transformative potential. But my question emerged, and you already touched a bit, but I would be interested in how do these book clubs reproduce and also at the same time maybe dismantle the fourth wall that separates knowledge production from lived experience, and what or in what way does this tension that emerges, what does it reveal about the politics of participation in these literary spaces? Yes.
Yeah, thank you. That's another great question. Just writing down. There's been quite a bit of research on book clubs as method, particularly in communities, and you know, some of the findings are around shifting reading or developing new knowledge around the value, the well-being value. There's a whole range of research on that. We settled on the book clubs for pragmatic reasons, because we wanted something that was virtual, but also because, and I think I mentioned it earlier, in terms of English teaching, the ways in which there's a, you know, perhaps to just give a bit of context, there's major challenges in Australia around the professionalising of teachers or the deprofessionalising of teachers, and in a teaching shortage. So we have a massive teaching shortage globally, and it's profound in Australia. There's very little resource now for what we would call CPD, or teacher continuing professional learning. And often it's taken in-house in schools, which then reproduces knowledges in certain kinds of ways. So this work we wanted, and when teachers do go to, say, English teachers conferences, they're often presented with, I call it tips and tricks for teaching, you know, things that they're going to be able to use very soon, and some advice around a text they may teach. And it's become a kind of admiring book festival. If in some ways you'll have writers, you know, new writers coming in, and this is sometimes from overseas. And again, you know, very much an input driving. So we wanted a book club because we wanted a method that had at its heart sociability, literary sociability, but also conversation and dialogue, and the book at the centre. We also recognise, though, it is, and I mentioned, you know, it has its own expectations, and it also is open to the dominance of voices. We are in there as facilitators of the book club. True book clubs don't have facilitators, you know, so it's a kind of hybrid between a conversation and a tutorial in some ways. So I think there are, and in terms of the politics of participation, the facilitation is really, if I understand your question sort of correctly, the facilitation means that, unlike a kind of book club which might be open to the dominance of voices, we are there as facilitators to attempt to support the conversation as it flows. By book club 3 now, we are at a point where the participants are knowing each other, and so we are less and less required to facilitate. And in fact, you know, that the conversation is quite robust. But we are seeing, and we're not seeing it as, in terms of the lived experience, it depends on the person's lived experience. People are very much still thinking about the lived classroom experience. And so they're bringing in, if you think of, so there's multiple walls here. There's them as professionals, the fourth wall of their classroom kind of being exposed to us. So I think it has some courage, and I think that there is from what I have in taking half the book groups and reading transcripts from the ones that Claire's taking, my sense is that we are getting at questions of what is knowledge and knowing in literary studies in 2025 in Australia in ways that we would not be. In the example I was giving earlier with the participant who was somewhat reluctant, and very frustrated with the text, what was extraordinary for me was those teachers in the group drawing on other texts in their conversation and animating multiple ways of knowing within that space. So it was dynamic enough to be able to enable an unsettling of knowledge and knowing that was done by those teachers. But it's hard for me to say yet fully, Shanti, but that's my thinking around the method of the groups. It's not going to be, it's certainly not an answer. Yeah. Did you have another question as well, Shanti, or comment? Not sure.
No, I just wanted to say thank you. Yes, thank you.
Pleasure.
Yes.
Are there other questions there on the horizon or responses? Well, I have something that I'd like to bring back into the discussion. I was very struck by the words that were spoken by Dyaba Yunupingu.
Yeah.
In his effectively what was a welcome to country, but what struck me was that it was I mean, it's something that we know from Kim Scott's work on the Friendly Frontier in what is now Western Australia, and the idea that fundamentally country is welcoming. There's all sorts of rules and regulations. You can't just wander in and stamp all over it. There are protocols. There are rules and regulations. There are places where you have to stop and ask permission. You have to be inducted into the sort of the customs and the manners and the all sorts of ways of behaving and making sure that you observe your place within a whole order of custodian, as you were saying before, custodian stewardship, and that, but at the same time, fundamentally, it's a welcoming environment. And what fascinated me was that the words, and I just scribble them down, so they might not be quite right, but you are in our constitution already.
Yes. Yeah, I know.
So the idea that in fact you don't have to do anything, sort of a way you don't have to do anything. It's not all about white agency. How are we going to teach ourselves to read? But it seems to me it's more about how are we going to recognize what is already there, recognize the kinships and networks that even as as um, as as white Europeans we are part of, but we're just very, very bad at seeing.
Mm,
But the sort of the weight of agency actually is always already onto country rather than onto ourselves.
mm,
Yes, we do have to do something, but that it's not we don't have to do all the heavy lifting ourselves. And it reminds me of the work done by Tim Morton about being ecological, where he says you don't have to be ecological. You always are already
mm.
ecological. You can't avoid being ecological, part of the environment, and it's just a matter of starting to recognize that and recognize the implications of that. So what I'm wondering is what happens when you start to turn around that whole structure of agency as readers, as learners, as literary pedagogy people, from a sort of a gigantic impossible task of trying to reform our reading practices and reshape our cosmologies. What happens when you start to recognize that agency is also held by others and by non-human others in quite radical ways? I don't know what the answers are. It's just what I was mulling over during while you were talking.
Yeah, I think it's a great framing, Russ, because you're right, even in the thinker, and it seems to me that in the book clubs there's that tension, between, and that goes back to the Deborah Dank example right at the start. It's there, that the turkeys are there. They're there in the landscape. It's just about seeing what's actually already there. And I think that's a lovely thing, for you to be highlighting about the work. It does require, if not a learning to read differently, Sandra Phillips talks about it all the time as an unlearning, which not about it. So that's a kind of, which has its own action or activity, but it's not about taking agency in this space. It is about the giving up of, the unlearning. So that could be, and she often refers to the work as practices of unlearning. But I think in terms of framing the work, because it does feel monumental to teachers, it does feel particularly as, there's in terms of kind of real lived proximity, and our colleagues may know this, that Indigenous peoples in Australia are sort of 3.9% of the population of 27 million. And so Sandra Phillips, again quoting her, would say that white settlers and others need to do the heavy lifting of the work. But I think it's, what does that heavy lifting look like? And it might not be the heavy lifting of what we might anticipate, which is just us taking over another reading practice, being able to kind of, import, frame up, extract. And I'm not sure how we explain that, but I think that's the challenge, isn't it? That's the challenge for us in all of this work together.
Yeah, it's fascinating and existential. But my feeling is we also don't really have the tools for doing that, and that's probably what's happening in the book.
Yes.
That part of what we're trying to do is actually even invent ways of thinking how we think, or ways of yeah. Do we have other questions there, or comments from people in the group? Nothing, no other. Maybe just then, because we are gradually getting to the end of the time, can I just sort of wind up with a few? I don't want to try and summarize what you've said, but just a few things that I think I would, for myself, I would take away. For the first one is curiosity and eagerness to read, for instance, the word of Deborah Dunk, that I don't know at all. This is completely unfamiliar territory to me. Another would be to find out. I mean, I've read some of the work coming out of your group, but not all of it. And of course, more work is coming out at the moment. So I'd like to get more of a sense of and some of the pieces that you were quoting were extremely seemed to be extremely interesting, and we're throwing up all sorts of novel approaches that. So I'm left wondering, for instance, the notion of caring as country that you. I remember writing this down in the summer, and then of course 3,000 other things sort of
Yes, yeah.
carry all the interesting thoughts that one takes out of these sort of papers. But what does that mean once you start to think about it and work out the implications? And so that would be something that I would take with me. The notion of at the moment, I have a strong feeling that issues of climate have simply been sidelined by issues of war and conflict, particularly here
crisis.
in Europe, where we have a sense of sort of slowly sliding towards or sliding into a much larger, very slowly sliding into a much larger conflict, and of course of authoritarian forms of government, which is also worrying us extremely here. So how can we reintegrate those sort of issues into the things that we're thinking about? And generally the notion of precarity at very many different levels, which is very much in our utmost in our minds. But at the same time, I think what was coming through much of what you said, for instance, is the passing comment about 65,000 years of indigenous life, and in Australia, that there are other time frames that are in a sense not precarious. I mean, country is there, and as I think as I'm not quite sure which indigenous speaker or thinker it was, but said the country is there and it will always be there. You can't get rid of country. You can do terrible things. You can damage the environment. You can kill indigenous people and whole groups. Australia has a history of genocide, but country itself is there and ongoing. So I mean, there's some of the thoughts that I would be taking with me from the discussion. So thank you very much for all of that, and the way it overlaps with literary reading and classroom teaching and relearning teaching in a pedagogical context.
Thank you, Russ, and thank you, colleagues, for the time. It's been great to be here in whatever time frame you're in at the moment. All right. Well, thank you very much, Russ, and look forward to connecting again soon.
Yeah. And we look forward to the conversation going on. These forums will keep on happening, and we hope that these discussions will also be sustainable, not precarious in
Indeed.
years.
Thanks so much.
Thank you very much to everyone. Thanks for the organisers of the forum for making this possible and for the technical support. And thanks to everyone who contributed. And some of you I'll be seeing around the next few days anyway after work. Okay.
If I may allow myself, just a quick reminder for today, there are still 2 panels taking place. German time, 3:30, there's the second panel entitled Recreating Reality's Critical Praxis in Precarious Times. And at 5:30, kind of a continuation of this discussion about proximate classrooms in the future, hosted by Professor Wes Pavlov. I know it will be deep in the night for some of you, but if you want to join us, you're more than welcome.
Thank you very much.
May see you later on. Okay, take care.
Bye for now. Bye
Stay
now.
well. Bye. Thanks, Larissa.